Hairdresser Ethan Blake, 26, deliberately infected his partners with HIV after meeting them on the gay dating app Grindr, a court has heard. He was accused of deceiving his lovers by falsely claiming he was HIV negative, insisting on unprotected intercourse, and tampering with condoms to spread the virus. The courtroom was a theater of tension, every breath held, every movement deliberate. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your stomach churn. Ethan Blake sat in the dock, his posture relaxed, his face an unreadable mask. His hands rested on his lap, fingers interlaced as if he were waiting for a bus rather than facing a life-altering verdict. Across from him, 10 men sat in the gallery, their faces etched with a spectrum of emotions: anger, grief, disbelief, and a haunting emptiness. They were bound together by a shared nightmare, their lives irrevocably altered by the man who now sat before them, seemingly unfazed. The prosecutor, Eleanor Whitmore, rose from her seat. Her presence commanded the room, her sharp eyes cutting through the silence like a blade. She adjusted her glasses and fixed Ethan with a stare that could freeze fire. "Mr. Blake," she began, her voice crisp and deliberate, "did you knowingly and deliberately infect your partners with HIV?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, a smirk playing on his lips. "I never forced anyone," he replied, his tone casual, almost amused. Ms. Whitmore's lips tightened, her patience visibly thinning. "So you deny sending this message to one of your victims?" She held up a printed screenshot of a text message that read, "I have HIV. Oops. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of shock and disgust. One of the victims, a young man with sunken eyes and a hollow expression, let out a sharp breath and turned away, as if the words had physically struck him. Ethan shrugged, his nonchalance infuriating. "I was joking." "A joke?" Ms. Whitmore snapped, her voice rising. "You were diagnosed with HIV in April 2015. You knew the risks. You were told explicitly by doctors that failing to disclose your status and engaging in unprotected intercourse could lead to prosecution. And yet here we are." She turned to the jury, her gaze sweeping over them like a searchlight. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the behavior of a man who made a mistake. This is the behavior of a predator." The first victim to take the stand was Matthew Harris. He was a slight man in his late 20s, his once bright eyes now shadowed by exhaustion and pain. As he stepped into the witness box, his hands trembled, gripping the edges as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "I met Ethan on Grindr," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was charming, confident. He told me he was clean. I believed him." Matthew paused, swallowing hard. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the faint rustle of his shirt as he shifted uncomfortably. "We spent the night together," he continued, his voice cracking. 2 months later I got sick. I went to the clinic and they told me I was HIV positive. I was in shock. I hadn't been with anyone else." Ms. Whitmore nodded, her expression softening momentarily. "And how did Ethan respond when you confronted him?" Matthew's lips quivered and he looked down at his hands. "He laughed," he said, his voice breaking. "He said, 'Well, now we're in this together.'" A gasp spread through the courtroom, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Ethan, however, remained unmoved, rolling his eyes as if the entire proceeding were beneath him. The next victim, Jonathan Reese, took the stand. He was 25, with a quiet, reserved demeanor that made his pain all the more palpable. His voice was soft but steady as he recounted his story. "I thought we were in a relationship," he said, his words heavy with emotion. "I trusted him. I loved him." Ethan chuckled at that, a low, mocking sound that echoed in the silence. Judge Margaret Hayes shot him a sharp look, her disapproval evident. Ms. Whitmore pressed on. "Jonathan, did you ever find anything suspicious in Mr. Blake's possession?" Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "One morning I saw a condom in the trash. It looked strange. When I picked it up I saw that the tip had been cut off. I didn't think much of it at first. I thought maybe it was defective. But then I found another. And another." The weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a thick fog, suffocating and inescapable. Detective Inspector Simon Harper of Sussex Police was the next to testify. A seasoned officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, he recounted the investigation that led to Ethan's arrest. "When we first brought him in, he denied everything," Harper said, his voice steady. "He told us he was HIV negative. But when we checked his medical records, the truth came out." Ms. Whitmore turned to Ethan, her gaze piercing. "And what did you do when you were released on bail?" Ethan's smirk returned, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. Detective Harper answered for him. He ran. He changed his name to Liam Carter and moved to Northumberland. He continued using Grindr. He infected 2 more men before we caught him. Ethan's lawyer, Richard Galbraith, a wiry man with a sharp tongue, finally spoke up. Detective Harper, can you confirm whether Mr. Blake was undergoing any psychiatric evaluations at the time? Harper sighed, clearly frustrated by the line of questioning. There were indications that he displayed emotionally unstable personality traits, but there was no official diagnosis of a disorder. Galbraith pounced. So it is possible my client was not in full control of his actions? Harper's frown deepened. Mr. Blake knew exactly what he was doing. The evidence speaks for itself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, each minute stretching into an eternity for those waiting. When they finally returned, the courtroom was electric with tension. On the charges of deliberately infecting multiple individuals with HIV, how do you find the defendant? The foreman of the jury stood, his voice steady but heavy with gravity. Guilty. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the victims, a release of pent-up anguish and fear. Ethan, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion. His smirk faltered, his mask slipping ever so slightly. Judge Hayes leaned forward, her expression stern and unyielding. The messages you sent make it crystal clear you knew exactly what you were doing, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Your actions were cruel, senseless, and have left your victims with a life sentence of their own. I cannot see how and when you will no longer be a danger to society. Ethan said nothing, his face a blank slate. The judge delivered the sentence. Life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years. There was no applause, no cheers, just the silent, heavy relief of justice served. As Ethan was led away, he cast one last look at his victims. Matthew met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet resolve, he turned his back on him. And Ethan Blake disappeared through the courtroom doors, his smirk gone at last. Outside the courtroom, the victims gathered, their relief tempered by the weight of what they had endured. Matthew stood apart, staring at the ground, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Matthew shook his head. I don't know if I'll ever be okay. But at least it's over. Jonathan nodded, his own eyes distant. Yeah, it's over. The 2 men stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken bond of shared pain holding them together. Meanwhile, Detective Harper watched from a distance, his expression grim. It's not over for them, he muttered to himself. Not really. And he was right. For the victims, the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, a constant reminder of the betrayal they had endured. But for now they could take solace in the fact that justice had been served. Ethan Blake was gone, but the echoes of his actions would linger, a haunting reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of its betrayal. Kindly support me by subscribing to my channel, like my video and leave a comment. Your support means the world to me.